This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited Magic. The limited format available right now on Magic Arena, the main limited format is Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. And while I plan on doing more content on that topic, even though it seems to be not super popular, I'm actually not in a great place to talk about that format right now. I was out of town for several days, almost a week, and I haven't had as much time as I would like to actually play the new format. So in this video, I'm going to do a more general topic. We're going to be looking at 10 mechanics that I think are good for limited. And we'll do a crack-a-pack at the end of Baldur's Gate, but next week I'll be back with a more Baldur's Gate-centric topic. For now, though, I want to look at these 10 mechanics that I think are great for limited that I'd like to see more of, really. And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily that they're powerful. I mean that they're good for the limited gameplay experience. So keep that in mind. All right, so at number 10, I have Scry. You're going to see a lot of mechanics on this list that basically the function they have is they make it harder for you to get mana screwed or mana flooded. And I think the best games of Magic are, of course, the ones where both you and your opponent get to play as much Magic as possible. The variance of having problems with lands is part of the game, and it certainly is. And sometimes people need to be punished for having bad mana bases, not running enough lands, running too many lands, and that'll all still happen. But I do like mechanics that make it a smaller percentage of the time that one player just doesn't get to play the game. And that's what Scry is. It's a mechanic, of course, that lets you look at, some number of cards on the top of your library, and you choose to put them on the top or the bottom, and that's it. And you can also put them back in any order, if it's more than Scry 1. And this is nice because, in the early game, you can use it to help you find land. In the late game, you can use it to help you not draw land. So it does exactly what I think good mechanics do for limited, and that is that it limits having those serious problems. And if you're somebody who is using effects that's letting them scry regularly, you're going to have a much better late game than your opponent who's just drawing cards the normal way, and they're going to draw some number of lands while you're drastically reducing the chances of doing so. So scry is a good mechanic, and it is one that's evergreen these days. I'm happy we're seeing it a lot. It's really the only one on this list. It is the only one on this list that I think is straight up evergreen. At number 9, I have Investigate. So this came from one of, is it Shadows over Innistrad or is it Eldritch Moon? It's from one of them. I think it's Shadows over Innistrad originally that it showed up in. And so this mechanic creates an artifact token. And it was really the first of these mechanics we saw that creates an artifact token that then does a thing later in the game, like as a mechanic that's all over the set. And that's what Investigate did. It gives you these clue tokens. I loved the blue-green archetype in the format that was all about clues, especially. But clues are another sort of effect that can also allow you to smooth out your game if things are going poorly. In particular, if you're flooding out late, you can you can sacrifice a clue token to draw more cards. It really lets you do that. And, it's also a mana sink ability. If you're flooding out, you can just spend the mana to draw the card. And I like that. So it's another one of these mechanics that smooths things out. As is number 8, which is Blood. This is more recent. It's another artifact token thing, a mechanic that creates an artifact token that then does a thing. You don't straight up draw with this. So it's, in a lot of ways inherently less powerful than Investigate. But the fact it only cost 1 to rummage with them, which is discard a card and draw a card, is a big deal. And just like they did with Investigate, they made it into a very real archetype in Midnight Hunt, I think. These two Innistrad sets run together, as do the two original, not original, but second trip to Innistrad sets were running together in my head for me too. But, it's in one of those. I'll have the right one on the screen, I'm sure. But the point is that the Blood is a mechanic that lets you throw away, a land that you don't need and draw something else. And, usually that's what you use them for in the late game. In the early game, you can sometimes use them to give you land if that's what you desperately need. Similarly, and a mechanic I sort of looked at including here was Connive, because it's, into the battlefield, rummage. And so, I think it does deserve to be here too, but I think Blood is sort of a less powerful way of doing it that I think we could see more regularly. Obviously, you can't call them blood tokens in the future because that's very vampire-centric. I guess anytime we see vampires, they could have them, but it's hard to have blood tokens, but some sort of token that's like blood would be a good thing for limited formats going forward. And number 7, I have Kicker. So this isn't one exactly that makes it so you don't get mana screwed as often or you don't get flooded as often. Exactly, it's not exactly that. But what I like about cards with Kicker, and it's true of a lot of different cards, the joke is, every mechanic is basically Kicker, right? But, any card that lets you pay an additional cost in the later game when you have a bunch of mana to do something more powerful is good for limited. These cards that you're able to play early, and they do a thing, maybe they're just like a 3 mana 2/3, they're generic, but then in the late game when you have a ton of mana, you can pay all that mana and do something more powerful. In Dominaria there was a centaur that gained you 10 life if you paid the Kicker, and that was an amazing way to stabilize for you in the late game, and in the early game it was just a decent body. You also had in Dominaria Gitu, not Lava Runner, but Gitu, Sorcerer, whatever, card will be on the screen. This card was a 2 mana 1/3, but if you kicked it, you could get spells back from your graveyard. Like, this is just a great mechanic where your cards are going to be similarly impactful all game long. And I think that smooths things out in a different way than things like Blood, Investigate, and Scry do. At number 6, I have Snow Matters. So this is sort of a completely different category. I think any sort of mechanic that makes you make weird decisions during a draft, decisions that in any other draft format would be insane, I think they're very interesting. They make draft formats far more engaging. And the Snow Matters theme that we saw, especially as it was implemented in Kaldheim, was amazing. You would have situations where you take a basic snow forest over a solid playable card, and that's because you had so many good snow payoffs in the format. And so this sort of effect is very interesting for draft. Similarly, but not quite as well implemented, I don't think, we saw in Amonkhet, the deserts, where you had desert payoffs. There weren't nearly as many of these deserts floating around as there were of like basic snowlands in Kaldheim, but they had a similar impact where sometimes you'd take a desert because you have 2 desert payoffs and the other card in the pack, isn't that good. So you would start taking lands that, in the case of deserts, come into play tapped and produce only 1 mana of color, and in the case of the snow basics, do come into play untapped, but they're still just basic lands. When any format where you're taking those over normal cards, I think is really interesting. So this is a mechanic that I think is really good for the draft portion, just because of the interesting decisions, as opposed to one that sort of smooths things out. At number 5, I have Morph. This is another one that it's kind of like Kicker in that it makes it so it's a lot harder for you to have bad starts in the early game, because any card with Morph, you can at the very least play as a 3 mana 2/2 face down. And so if your deck has a bunch of Morphs in it, you can get away with not actually having that many 3-drops in your deck, because all your Morphs basically are 3-drops. And so it makes it so you can play this thing early, and then in most cases, you can pay significant mana later or do something later to flip the card over for a more powerful card that might even do something when it's turned face up. So this is another mechanic that doesn't, smooth out your draws necessarily, but it smooths out your mana, and it makes it less likely that you're going to have a slow start, because every one of your Morph creatures is a Grey Ogre at worst, and then in the later part of the game they can become more impactful. At number 4, I have Learn and Lesson. So like Snow Matters, this is a couple of mechanics, I guess, in a technical sense, where you're making interesting decisions during the draft. So cards with Learn let you grab a Lesson, and a Lesson is a card in your sideboard that has the Lesson subtype. And a lot of these lessons in a vacuum don't look like very good cards. Cards like Intro to Annihilation, 5 generic mana, exile an opposing permanent, might even just be destroy. Your opponent draws a card. You wouldn't play that basically ever in a limited format. However, when you start tacking it on to your cards that have Learn, that usually have a decent effect, like an Into the Battlefield ability, like, Professor of Symbology, you get a 2 mana 2/1 that then just tacks this card on and puts it into your hand. that's a whole other thing, you know. And so you end up taking, in that limited format, which is Strixhaven, I should mention, you end up taking lessons, cards for your sideboard that in a normal format wouldn't be very good. You end up taking them over solid playables all the time, because the more powerful, the more options you have among your lessons, the more powerful every single card in your deck with Learn becomes, because you have this amazing modality to grab. You know, you can grab your Intro to Annihilation or your Environmental Sciences if you need mana. You can grab Inkling Summoning if you really need a 3-drop after playing your Professor of Symbology. Like, it was just a really cool mechanic, and part of what I think made Strixhaven, for me, one of the better limited formats over the last couple of years, because it was just fascinating, first, to sort of evaluate these cards, figure out what was going on with them, and then to sort of see what was happening and modify the draft strategy as it became clear that all of these lessons were actually way better than they looked, as were all the cards with Learn. And it made for really interesting choices during drafts, and I like that mechanic a lot. Wouldn't hate seeing something like it again in the future. You know, Strixhaven has this Learn lesson thing going on. You know, it's a school, so it makes sense. They may have to, like with Blood, sort of revamp it, but I don't know. We're about to go to Dominaria. You know, there's an academy there for people. Maybe they could introduce Learn lesson there. I'd be happy if they did. At number 3, I have Flashback. So again, this is sort of like Morph, sort of like Kicker, where for most of them, you cast the thing early for sort of, usually, frequently with the card with Flashback, you pay extra mana to cast the thing. But then the bonus is, in the later part of the game, or at some point in general, you can then pay mana to cast that card again. So you end up getting 2 cards worth of value out of 1. It smooths out your mana if you're flooding out, because you have something to do with it. If you have a significant number of cards with Flashback in your deck, it's just hard not to end up having something to do with your mana every turn, and that's a good way to win a game. And it also makes the game not feel like it's being decided by the fact that you're just top decking lands over and over and the game is over. At number 2, I have Cycling. This one is probably a little contentious because Ikoria really, you know, it featured cycling. It's a mechanic originally introduced way back in Urza's Saga, but I think the most recent format to really feature it as a main mechanic was Ikoria. You know, we saw it on Tri-Lands and Capenna, but that was it. And in that format, they made the archetype way too good. It was a pretty busted color pair. It was red-white. Too many powerful payoffs and all that. I'm not asking for that to happen every format. In fact, I'd prefer there isn't a cycling deck in formats for the most part. I'd rather just see it show up on more cards, because this is another one of these mechanics that smooths out your draws for you. It's especially nice when it's on lands, you know, to bring up lands that we talked about earlier. The deserts also had cycling, and that made it so if you're flooding out late, you can just, you know, you need top deck one of those. You don't just, you know, want to crumple up the card and walk away from the table. You can cycle it away and then hopefully, you know, not draw another land, which sometimes happens. But the fact is, it decreases the number of times where that's going to happen. And if you put it on situational cards, and, you know, another thing I would say is it should usually be at least cycling 2 or 3, because putting cycling 1 on stuff was one of the problems with Ikoria. Cycling 1 is just too cheap. It allows you to just rip through your deck way too easily. It has to be cycling 2 or 3 on most things, or higher, for it to not mess up the format. But in a format where, you know, you draw your 6-drop on turn 2, and you've only got 2 lands in your opening hand, that feels brutal a lot of the time, but now you can just cycle it away because it has cycling, you know? And that really smooths out games multiple ways. You know, it can help you when it's on lands, it can help you get out of flood, and in the early game, it can let you throw away a card that's only going to be good late, and you don't know that you're going to make it to the late game at this point. You can throw it away and try to draw another card. So cycling is really good. We've got one left, and I think this one is the least likely of these to ever actually happen. Maybe I'm wrong. And that is modal double-faced cards that are lands on one side and spells on the other, like we had in Zendikar Rising. So the reason I don't think this is that likely to happen is because it will cause all kinds of problems in Constructed if they do it too much, and really, it already sort of made decks kind of homogenous and Constructed to begin with. So what's good about these? Well, the fact that on one side, it's a land. That's really it. You know, having a spell that can be a land is a big deal. In Limited, this means, you know, in Zendikar Rising, you could draft, like, you would run like 10 basics in your deck sometimes, and you'd have 5 or 6 modal double face cards that are also lands. And when you can just play them as lands, that just makes a spell so much better. And a lot of the spells, you know, aren't that powerful on their own, or they're situational. You know, like the 1 red mana one that does 1 damage to something and exiles it if it dies. You know, that card is not an incredible one, and it wouldn't really see play in most formats unless there were a lot of X1s around. But the fact is that you can play it as a land when doing 1 to something doesn't matter at all, and that's a big deal. And so sort of like cycling, where you can, you know, you have a land with cycling and you can just throw it away. In this case, if you don't need the land, you can play the spell, and if you don't need the spell, you can play the land. And this does an amazing job of smoothing things out. Like I said, the problem is they have to be careful with designing these. You know, limited formats are also giving us cards for Constructed, and that creates a problem potentially in Constructed, and already has really. You know, in Modern, they have the deck that where you play Undercity Informer, mill your whole library, and win the game, because a card like Undercity Informer doesn't see any lands in your deck if they're all modal double face cards. So, you know, there's stupid combo potential they have to look out for. There's balance problems in terms of just printing too good of them for some colors. Some decks being able to just run a bunch of these modal double face cards that are powerful, you know, when you cast them as spells, and when they can be lands when you need them. There are too many problems that can result from this. If there were a world where somehow they like created a limited format and it was completely isolated from Constructed, which would be an interesting use of alchemy potentially, you know, to create limited formats, you know, revamped limited formats where the cards in it are only legal and limited, and you could throw in some of these sorts of things to smooth out the format or whatever. That would be pretty cool, but it is kind of unlikely to happen. You know, for a lot of these mechanics, we do see them frequently, like cycling and flashback are things we see pretty regularly, as is kicker, and scry is evergreen. So that's one that we see all the time, but I'd like to see it even more. So yeah, those are 10 mechanics that I think are great for limited gameplay. They make limited games better, either because, well, 8 of them are mechanics that I think make the actual games better, and then 2 of them are mechanics and stuff that I think makes the draft portion more interesting. So that's my list. You know, let me know in the comments what you think of my list, what mechanics you think I could have included. There's a lot that one could. So, like I said, we'll do a Baldur's Gate Crack-A-Pack now, and as usual, we'll look at the cards in the pack. I'll talk about how I feel about each of them, and then I'll tell you which one I would first pick. So let's dive right into that. All right, our first common is Faraday's Fireball. This is one of the reprints from Forgotten Realms. It was a mediocre card there. It is here too. You know, if you need removal in red, it can do it, but it's not particularly good at it. Ganassi Rabble Rousers are next common. Basically, you know, in the set review, I didn't give any card with double team a lower grade than a C. They're just all so good because they give you 2 cards worth of value. And yeah, I mean, I think it's panned out that way. Every card with double team is a solid playable or better. And the Rabble Rouser is one of the better 2-drops in the format. So I'd definitely take it over the Fireball. Next up, we've got Grim Bounty. This is premium removal, just like it was in Forgotten Realms. You know, it's a little clunky for what it does, but the fact it gives you back that treasure helps soften that blow, and it can still kill most things, and that's important. I would take it over the Rabble Rouser at this point. You know, a card like it and like removal in general does get worse in a world of double team, because if you don't kill the double team creature quickly, there's going to be 2 of them, and then spot removal is not nearly as good. So you need a lot cheaper removal, you know, to deal with them, and Grim Bounty and Faraday's Fireball aren't it. But I do still like the bounty overall. Sepulchre Ghoul, you know, this has been pretty easy to take advantage of. There's lots of good things to sacrifice. You know, going into the format, I had it above Grim Bounty as Black's best common. And, you know, I think there's a few cards, black cards, that could have been on that list. But I still think Sepulchre Ghoul is better, the best common in the format, even better than the 2/1 Death Toucher. That said, at this point, I've actually drafted this format less than a lot of you because being out of town, like I said at the beginning of the video. But that's how I feel right now. Celestial Unicorn is next. This is a life gain payoff. It's, you know, there aren't a lot of them in the format. So if you're in green-white, the Unicorn is kind of a premium card for you. Outside of that, you don't really play it though. Would definitely take the Ghoul over it. Next common is Improvised Weaponry. Just like in Forgotten Realms, this is an alright removal spell. It's cheap, so it can deal with things quickly. It gives you back a treasure, which makes it feel even cheaper. And it can even go after your opponent, but I'm still on Sepulchre Ghoul. Clever Conjurer. It's been as mediocre here as it was in Forgotten Realms. You know, a lot of the commons in the format of Forgotten Realms reprints, if you didn't know that. In fact, all of them in this pack are, except for the Rabble Rouser. Oh wait, no, there's one other one that isn't. We'll get to it later. But the Conjurer, you know, the idea is it's supposed to ramp you and stuff, and it can, but it's clunky at doing it and not a particularly efficient creature. So I'm still on the Ghoul. Knoll Hunter is next. This is a great 2-drop, was in Forgotten Realms, still is here. It's a great aggressive creature that isn't that hard to make it bigger, but I think the Ghoul is still better. Demogorgon's Clutches, you know, like most Mind Rots, it's pretty mediocre. You cut it more than you play it. It's probably the worst of these cards that we've seen so far, so we're definitely not taking it. Ice Wind Stalwart is next. You know, this is a card that I think I don't have the best feel for right now from not playing the format as much as I normally have by this point. But I just don't like that it doesn't do something meaningful as often as it doesn't. You know, there are things it can blink. For sure, like there's good stuff to blink, but when you don't have those things, the fail case is just pretty miserable. I mean, a 4-mana 3/3 these days is pretty bad. So yeah, still on the Ghoul. Iron Golem's next. You know, not very good. It has good base stats. You know, it's got those Juggernaut stats, but unlike Juggernaut, it doesn't only attack if able, it also blocks if able, and it has Vigilance, which is a weird sort of downside here. Because it has to block every combat and attack every combat. So, yeah, still on the Ghoul. Guiding Bolt. This thing's solid. I mean, you know, we're talking about Scry in the video, how just adding it to cards can make them so much better. And this is a good example because we have this sort of card a lot, and it's usually not very good. It's usually more of a sideboard card than anything. But because this one costs only 3, because it's an instant and it has Scry, like I like having one of them in most of my white decks. It has enough targets. That said, still taking the Ghoul. We have the Green Gate next. These are all pretty good, but they're never things you really want to take with your first pick. They don't fix your mana. You know, mana fixing lands are sometimes things you take early, right? But these don't. They do give you a card later, which is great. It's, I guess, this is another sort of mechanic that fits into what we were talking about in the list in this video, in that the Seek effect on it gives you this land that does a thing in the late game. And that's nice. That's a nice effect to have. It's not quite a modal double face card or anything like that, but it is sort of in the same neighborhood. But yeah, we're still taking the Ghoul here. We're on that common. And I think, you know, before we get to our rare, it probably goes, I mean, I think Sepulchre Ghoul, Grim Bounty, Rabble Rouser, and then Knoll Hunter is probably what we're looking at right now. Yeah, but we do have a rare that we're going to take over all this stuff, and that is Grim Hireling. It makes a treasure token anytime one or more of your creatures deals combat damage to a player, and that, you know, is a nice effect already. It means you can play the Hireling and attack and immediately generate some value. But what really makes it a powerful card, and I think even in the lower range of being a bomb, is the fact that it can turn your treasure into removal spells. And there's plenty of ways to make treasure in the format, just attached to cards that are already solid, like Grim Bounty and Improvised Weaponry in this pack. And then it also generates treasure on its own. So, you know, you end up being able to use its ability to kill stuff pretty regularly. You know, it is a little undersized and a little bit vulnerable, and that's what keeps it from being like a massive bomb, because, you know, you can answer it with most removal in the format and you're okay. But because you can generate that treasure right away in a lot of situations where you play it and you have a good attack, so you get a treasure, you know, at least you're getting something most of the time. And then if they don't deal with it, it can really take over games. And that's what does make it a bomb for me. And I think we take it over the other stuff in this pack. I think it's Grim Hireling in the end. So that's the Crack-a-Pack. Next week, I'll have drafted this format a bunch more, and we'll have a video dedicated more to discussing it. I'll probably rank the archetypes or something like that for next week. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. You can support me directly if you want to. by various means, including becoming a patron, becoming a YouTube member, or buying merch, and you can find all those things in the description. If you're looking for more Nizzanotes or draft videos of this format, you should see some of that on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.